Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GoldFish Report. I'm your host, Louisa. Today is Wednesday, November 21st, 2018. And as we do every year, we do a special commemorative edition for the anniversary to commemorate John F. Kennedy. Sadly, we do this on the day that he was assassinated. But the bright side is it's my birthday, so we can always look.
That's right.
Right, Jim?
Happy birthday, Louisa.
Thank you. So, right, November 22nd, it's actually my birthday, and I have a very, very, as you can imagine, special relationship to this topic. So today, as you can see, joining me to discuss this, I'm going to pay a little homage to the former president, and then we're going to go into the forensics examination of Jim's analysis of the Zapruder film and the fact that the single bullet theory could never work, and we're going to discuss the entire work of evidence, or sorry, body of evidence that Jim Fetzer has done in his research regarding the JFK assassination. So thanks for joining me for this, Jim. Thanks for your presentation and for being with me to commemorate JFK.
Yes. A more comprehensive presentation would run a minimum of 3 hours. So here we're focusing on the Zapruder film, which is the way most people understand the assassination to have taken place. But they turn out to be mistaken in major respects that I shall explain.
So I'm going to first start out, since time is of the essence right here, I'm going to first start out by sharing a very well-known clip, as you all are familiar with. I'm going to also minimize this so we can just listen for a minute or two of the president's address to the American Newspaper Publishers Association from 1961. This is a very important speech, and I'd like to just play a little bit because I want to honor the life of this man, and I want to honor his legacy and what, in fact, he was really trying to do, and why I'm going to show how there's so much relationship, there's so many similarities between President Trump, our present president, and late President Kennedy, that I feel in so many ways almost like there's an essence of John F. Kennedy still with us to finish the job. So let's listen for a minute.
I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater...
Can you up the volume?
Yeah.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society.
The volume's too low, Louisa.
Okay.
And to secret proceedings.
It's okay in my ear set.
We decided long ago
I can't turn it up anymore.
of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Okay, just ruined that.
There is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized exposures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, It may never be declared in the traditional fashion.
That's right.
Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe.
Very
The
true.
survival of our friends is in danger. And yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war, before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match.
And I'm going to stop there because I think, Jim, and tell me what you think about this, but I think President Trump could be saying those very same words today. Would you
Oh, I
agree?
think there's much to that, Louisa. Yes, yes, yes.
Do you
He
agree?
began, of course, campaigning to get us out of the Middle East, those endless wars we're fighting on behalf of Israel, and to improve relations with Russia. But at this point in time, his foreign policy now appears to be dominated by neocons who are Zionists and proponents of Israel's interests rather than those of the United States. And the whole Russia probe, the whole fabricated issue has really compromised his ability to improve relations with Russia. So while I believe he began on the path that JFK would have embarked upon in contemporary times, he has been compromised, and I can only hope he's able to work his way through the morass of opposition, deception, deceit, chicanery that's been thrown against him.
Well, thanks for your feedback and your point of view on that, Jim. I think that as those words came across the screen, there was, it's so eerie that I feel that they resonate today. I feel that even within the press corps, they resonate within the press briefing rooms when I'm present. That the president can't have, there's no declaration of war yet. You can't tip your hand to the enemy. So it's very hard when the enemy's within. How do you fight this war? So this is significant. Before we start the slides on the Zapruder film, I just want to quote one area from JFK's inauguration speech that I think is as relevant today as it was then. And I think President Trump would probably agree. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance? North and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind. Will you join in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its honor of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion, which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. I hear those words are resounding today, Jim, as loud as they were back in 1961. And I think this is exactly where the president is. They're just switching places. It seems like they're just switching characters. The scene and the storyline is the same, and it hasn't changed. And because he knew this information, and he wanted to fight against this monolithic conspiracy, this ruthless and monolithic conspiracy, the assassination happened. He was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. And so we are here to talk about who did it. So thank you, Jim.
Well, more specifically, we're here to talk about how it was done. But yes, indeed, who did it is going to become very, very apparent. We have, of course, the official account of 3 shots fired from the 6th floor window, scoring 2 hits and 1 miss. Other buildings here are of crucial importance, known as the County Records Building, from which it'll turn out a shot was fired. The Dal Tex in the middle, from which 3 shots were fired. The Book Depository, from which no shots were fired from the 6th floor window, but some from the opposite side of the building. The grassy knoll, you see, number 1, where the fatal shot is supposed to have been administered. Actually, he was somewhat further down Elm Street, though it will turn out he was hit several times in the head. 2, where Abraham Zapruder was standing. 3, from which a shot was fired. 4 and 5 and 6 actually all represent locations from which shots were fired. 5, where a man by the name of James Teague was injured by a shot that hit the curbing, the shot that missed, but which had not been fired from the Book Depository, but from the Dal Tex. I have a book on this, over 500 pages, a great Zapruder film hoax with the best experts on the subject. Here's the camera that Abraham Zapruder was using, an 8mm Bell & Howell. It was a spring-wound handheld camera that used a 16mm strip of film. If you look below, on the right-hand side, you'd shoot down one side, and then you'd take the film out, flip it over, and shoot it down the other side. So if you wanted to actually show the whole strip, you'd have to develop it and split the film, and then, of course, edit it together. When fully wound, it ran about 73 seconds, exposing 15 feet of film with a double-8 film, as I have explained. Indeed, the existent film we have runs 27 seconds, 487 frames, but I'm going to explain why. It appears to me that we're missing more frames than we have in the available film today. The big picture, John P. Costello has done a brilliant tutorial on internal proofs that the film was, in fact, massively edited using the techniques of optical printing and special effects, whereby you could combine any foreground with any background. They could have had Jack Kennedy doing backflips had they so desired. I will explain not only internal features, but external features and other ways in which we know the film, which many regard as the most authentic depiction we have of the assassination, is in fact a fabrication made out of original footage that's been subjected to extensive alterations, and whereas I am going to argue more frames are missing than we have available in the present version. You can find John Costello's tutorial about film alteration at assassinationscience.com. Just scroll down and you'll find it identified there. It's completely brilliant. This guy has a PhD in physics, specialty in electromagnetism. He has certified the films about 98% technically flawless, but the other 2% give the game away. Now, it's fascinating that if you were watching television the day of the assassination, such as on NBC, you would have heard the report of 2 shots that were widely broadcast that day. One was a shot to the throat, a small, clean puncture wound, obviously a wound of entry, that Malcolm Perry, MD, who had performed a simple straight tracheostomy through the wound to the throat, explained 3 different times to the press assembled during the Parkland press conference was a wound of entry, that the bullet was coming at him. Subsequently, during the day, they report that the president also had been shot in the head, causing a blowout at the back of the head attributed to Admiral George Merkley, the president's personal physician. This is completely fascinating because those are the 2 shots that the Warren Commission had to suppress because they were both fired from the front or the right front. Indeed, later in the day, we had one of the brilliant newsmen who was listening to these reports, and when it began to trickle in that the shooter was supposed to be above and behind, he made the following observation: this is incongruous. How can the man have been shot from in front, from behind? Notice here the diagram. On the right-hand side, you see the 2 shots I've described, the shot to the throat, which was fired from inside the triple underpass, and the shot to the right temple that passed through and blew out a chunk of his skull in the back, fired from the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence. But in addition, he was hit twice before either of those shots were fired, once from the top of the county records building, hitting him in the back about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column. And again, after the limousine was brought to a halt from the Daltex in the back of the head. I'll go through and also explain that David Mantic, during a conference in which I participated this weekend, explained the evidence why he believes there was in fact a 3rd shot to the head. Now, Louisa, here's a frame from the Zapruder film, and we're going to watch the film here in a preliminary fashion. We'll see it several times. Zapruder said he started filming when the motorcade first came into view, but you'll see there's a giant jump because the driver swung out too widely, nearly hit a concrete abutment. I believe that would have taken about 5 seconds. At 18.3 frames per second, that's about 100 frames there. And you'll notice, you see what appears to be the shot to the head, but that too has been manufactured, as I'll explain. They're actually merging 2 or even what may turn out to be 3 shots. I'll talk about the spectators here, which are all but motionless, and other indications about how the film has been edited, including the driver's head turn, where he turns back and then turns forward faster than is humanly possible. Twice as fast, in fact, where Noel Twyman hired professional tennis players to test. When the film was and found that the rear head turn in the video is occurring about twice as fast as humanly possible, which might not sound like much until you realize that would turn a 4-minute mile into a 2-minute mile. Now, when the film was originally printed in the 26 volumes of supporting, there were frames out of order. Here you see 13, 14, 15, 16, where 313 is a frame where Jack is hit. But when they were printed in the order 313, 15, 14, 16, which mitigates the back and to the left, the rather violent motion that turns out to have been an artifact from the excessive editing and removing too many frames. In fact, the camera had settings of single frame, 24 frames per second, and 48 frames per second as slow motion. The FBI claimed what we have available came in at 18.3, which isn't even a proper setting on the camera, but resulted from the removal of too many frames to be authentic. Now, it's fascinating that if you superimpose frame 312 just before the headshot 313, there's a sharp forward motion before the left, back into the left, back into the left. This is because after the driver, William Grimm, pulled the limousine to the left, Jack was hit in the back of the head. He slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up, and after she had him up, he was hit in the right temple by a bullet that passed through and knocked out a big chunk of his brains at the back of his head, and a fragment known as the Zapruder fragment, a triangular patch. What David Mantik has now explained is that it appears when Jackie was easing him up, he was actually hit in the forehead by a shot fired from the south knoll, opposite the grassy knoll, by a mercury bullet that distributed particles of metal throughout his brain, so that we actually have 3 shots to the head. Heretofore, I had assumed the metallic fragments were from the shot fired from the right front that blew out the back of his head by virtue of shock waves. David has now clarified his findings, and as the leading expert on the medical evidence in the world today, he is as close as we come to definitive on these issues. Here's a graph. These 2 images both appeared in Josiah Thompson's film 6 Seconds in Dallas, published in 1966, which actually provides a lot of evidence of conspiracy. Here you see the forward motion at 3:12 to 3:13 from that shot to the back, and then the back and to the left, which incidentally no one in Dealey Plaza observed. He simply slumped to the left, and that's because it didn't happen. It was an artifact. Here we have a color sequence. Life magazine, which purchased the film on Saturday after the assassination on Friday, published frames, but actually broke the plate twice in order to get the text for this in note 6, claiming that this one frame could enable us to determine the location from which the shot had been fired, which, as anyone familiar even with geometry is aware, is preposterous, since you can only define a line by at least 2 points, not by 1. But that was the effort they made. It's unheard of to break a plate even once. In this case, they broke it twice because they wanted to make sure it would sound plausible to the public. Blood and brains across the trunk, and the drivers pulling to the left and bringing the vehicle to a halt had to be removed because it was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity in setting up JFK for the hit. Now, there are internal inconsistencies in the film. Let's begin with the head wound. The head wound cannot be observed in early frames. When I reviewed later frames, I found it in frame 374. Larry Rivera discovered it's also outlined by Jackie's white glove in previous frames. So what happened is, as you can see here, there's a little darkness at the back of the head. This is supposed to be when the shot is occurring. As I've explained, it's a merge of several shots. Here you see again this darkness at the back of the head, darkness at the back of the head, darkness at the back of the head. One of the presentations that occurred now at the conference in Dallas this weekend was from Hollywood film restoration experts who had a superior version of the Zapruder film, who reported they were appalled to discover the amateur way in which the blowout at the back of the head had been altered. And by the way, you see that whitish blob, that actually appears to be the blowout at the back of the head that they moved forward to make it look as though that had been an effect of a shot from behind. But the crudeness is stunning. A reason that they were spending so much time in concealing the wound, and Louisa, they appeared to have done it by blowing up the frames, painting out the blowout in black, and then shrinking the frames back and reshooting them, where the Hollywood group actually explained that the black patch on the back of the head moves around. It occurred to me they might have overlooked that it could be visible in later frames, and I found in 374 and 375, as Jackie is climbing back on the trunk after a chunk of Jack's skull and brains, you can actually see the blowout. Here's a close-up. Look there, you see the bluish matter. This is a blowout from the shot that entered the right temple. You can see the skull, the pinkish there is a skull flap blown open. I now believe that's from the frangible or expanding bullet that entered the forehead when we differentiate between those 2 shots. So here you see, it was my suspicion those who were involved in reconstructing might have overlooked frames past 313, 317, 318, and I found it in 374. And here you can see a contrast between where it's blacked out, for example, at the bottom left, blacked out, and where you find it present in frame 374. Now, David Manick, who has not only a PhD in physics from Wisconsin and MD from Michigan, but is board certified in radiation oncology, which is the treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, entered the National Archives in 1992-93, and using a technique from physics known as optical densitometry, discovered that an area at the back of the lateral cranial X-ray, the X-ray of JFK's skull taken in this case from the right side, had been patched using a material much too dense to be human bone, which he identifies as area P for patch. And when you compare area P with a blowout at the back of the head, we can discern in frame 374, you can see the very close proximity where hair overlaps the actual defect in the frame. But there we have it. Larry Rivera discovered that Jackie's white glove actually provides a background to illustrate the enormity of the defect. This was a very substantial wound. Virtually the whole area you can see in white ought to have been Jack's skull. You have her right hand below, her left hand there, but it's providing a background against which you can see the enormity of the defect. Larry has done so much brilliant work. Here once again. Here again, this is using a modern technique called Blender, which gives you a 3D image. And notice the enormity of the defect, Louisa. Here's another version where we can see how serious this was, all based upon our study of the film. Would you like to offer a comment?
Yeah, could you go back to that last image that you just had? Now what we're looking at is a 3D. This is like an embossing kind of thing where we can see, let me see if my arrow will follow this. Here's Jackie's face. And here, now what is this representing here? Is this her hand?
Jackie's face. This is the defect here.
That's the defect. Look how deep that is huge.
Yes, it is. It was a huge defect, Louisa.
You can tell by the amount of shadowing, so you could see how deep it is. That's the defect. That's amazing.
And here's another with a blender. I mean, this is just so sensational that Larry made this discovery. Now, the sign turns out to be wrongly placed. Another presentation that took place was by Rick Russo, who showed a photograph of the Stemmons freeway sign, which had a hole in it. Obviously, they couldn't leave a sign with a hole in it because it would have blown the whole theory of a lone assassin firing 3 shots from the book depository with 2 hits and a miss. How can we account for this? Comparison of photos of the location and dimensions of the freeway sign reveal it was replaced by misplaced images. In other words, they had to take it out, and when they put it back in, they didn't do it right. Not as important as some other proofs, but demonstrates the revision of the film was extensive and not restricted to a few frames. So here you can see in the black and white there where the sign actually was, and then in the color from the film where they misplaced it when they put it back in, when they reconstructed the film. Here's a GIF created again by Larry Rivera, where you can see the dimensions. This is as another proof of the extent to which they went about revising the film to conceal the true causes of death of our 35th president.
Oh, Jim, hold on. Yeah. You are then insinuating right at this moment, and even prior, that whoever pulled the trigger is involved in faking the film.
Oh yeah, sure.
Is involved. And so so at that time in 1963, who would have sharpshooters that good that they could shoot a person in a moving vehicle without shooting the person inches away from them, number one, and number two, who would have access to the kind of equipment and then of course have access to controlling that information that they put out through the media? Who would do that, Jim?
Well, Louisa, we have more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up. This is rather fascinating because another report that came forth this weekend was that the Secret Service took all of Jack's metallic objects, his wristwatch, for example, rings and so forth, which might have deflected bullets, on the basis of the specious claim they needed to subject them to radiological tests to make sure they weren't radioactive, but it was really part and parcel of setting him up for the hit. The most conspicuous indication is putting the presidential limousine right up front when it ought to have been in the middle. It ought to have been preceded by the mayor, the vice president. A flatbed truck that was supposed to carry photographers to cover this major political event was canceled. the 110th Military Intelligence Unit, which ought to have been distributed throughout the city for crowd control, was ordered to stand down over the adamant opposition of its commanding officer. The motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 and instructed not to ride ahead forward of the rear wheels, which one of the officers said was the damnedest formation he'd ever heard of. We know this was involved the CIA, the military, the mafia, anti-Castro Cubans, the Texas oil men, the Israel. In fact, each of them seems to have put up their own shooter. A deputy sheriff was on top of the county records building. He fired the bullet that hit Jack in the back. An Air Force expert was inside the triple underpass. He fired the shot that hit Jack in the throat. There was a Dallas police officer who fired from the grassy knoll. He had to pull his shot because it would have hit Jackie, and they were under strict instruction she must not be harmed. Then we had anti-Castro Cuban in the Dow Tex firing 3 shots with a Mannlicher Carcano. Those were the only shots that were not silenced to create the acoustical impression of only 3 shots being fired. We have Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman in the book depository firing at John Connally and the mistaken impression it was Ralph Yarborough, the liberal Texas senator whom Lyndon despised. They had a huge argument that morning where Lyndon wanted to get Connally out and Yarborough in. But Jack overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. Then that shot from the intersection of the triple underpass and the grassy knoll was fired by a soldier of fortune who may have been the best shot in the world. So it's as though each of the groups contributed their own shooter. The film was taken to Hawkeye Works. This was a secret CIA lab adjacent to Kodak headquarters on Saturday. Originally taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C. on Saturday. Meanwhile, at Hawkeye Work, a secret CIA lab adjacent to Kodak headquarters in Rochester, they were working on a revised version of the film, which they brought to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Sunday and effected the replacement. So we have many other indications about how they edited the film. The all but motionless spectators, everywhere else on the motorcade, spectators are waving and cheering. During this portion, they were virtually motionless. The explanation appears to be the foreground was taken when the pilot car passed by. Here are just some scenes from the crowd elsewhere in the motorcade. I mean, actually, they spilled out 8, 10, 12 deep. We have a photograph on Elm Street where the president is beside a bus, and you could have had an assassin with a handgun who could have taken him out. The Secret Service didn't cover the windows. They didn't weld the manhole covers. They left 2 agents behind at Love Field. It was a disgrace, Louisa. And here you'll see what I'm talking about with the spectators, the all but motionless, because you'll see they hardly move at all. Just pay attention to that here. And this appears to be because they actually filmed this part of the footage when the pilot car went by before the presidential limousine was present. Notice how they're non-responsive? They're not cheering and waving as they are everywhere else in the motorcade. And what we think, you know, that's the one shot from the right front, actually, it conceals multiple wounds. Then we have external inconsistencies. A comparison, there were about 8 different films of different portions of the motorcade. The 2 most extensive are the Nix and the Zapruder, where the Nix is taken from the opposite side. You can see the Nix on the left. Jackie goes further back on the trunk, and Clint Hill comes further up in the Nix than he does in the Zapruder. Obviously, these are supposed to be the same event, but they give different representations. Both of the films have been altered. Notice in the Zapruder at the top, we have Clint Hill coming forward, but it's different in the Nix. Witness inconsistencies. Witnesses to the head wound, Dealey Plaza at Parkland at Bethesda. Here we have witness after witness reporting the blowout to the back of the head. They include at Dealey Plaza. They include at Parkland. I mean, you have physician after physician, the nurse. They include at Bethesda, seeing this blowout to the back of the head. Here you have Clint Hill himself at Warwick's bookstore in San Diego talking about the Kennedy detail. which is a book about the performance of the Secret Service in Dealey Plaza. And Louisa, to my astonishment, although Clint Hill has been consistent about this for over 50 years now, there's a sentence in the Kennedy detail where he lay across the body and saw a gaping fist-sized wound at the back of the head. And knowing that that was a fatal wound, he gave a thumbs down to his colleagues, which of course we also do not see in the Zapruder. So even his testimony, even if Clint had actually touched Jackie, the films don't show him pushing her into the seat, which is what he's maintained for 47 years. This was at the time of this report. In his former report of 30 November about the events, a copy of which is archived, as I lay over the top of the back seat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw part of his skull with hair on it, which is consistent with frame 374, but not with frames 313 through 316. Indeed, since this record was Warren Commission Exhibit CE, Commission Exhibit 1024, at least some of its members and staff had to be aware of observations of the first person to observe the head wound apart from Jackie herself. But even the Kennedy detail includes this sentence: and slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head, an observation of enormous significance in relation to the autopsy photographs and x-rays, as well as to the authenticity of the Zapruder film. Now, this is a diagram that was approved by Dr. Robert McClellan at Parkland Hospital. You can see the wound. Now, of course, we know more about it. Here is from Charles Crenshaw, who was the last physician to observe JFK. He gave me a diagram for my first collection of expert studies in assassination science, published in 1998, where you can see it both from the back, but from the side view, and you can tell how accurately he was depicting the wound. Then we have witnesses to the throat wound at Dealey Plaza at Parkland at Bethesda. Here you have the limousine. If you were to look closely where JFK's left ear would be, if his left ear were visible, there's a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole at the center. You see it on the left, indicative of the through and through wound. The Secret Service would later produce a completely different windshield with a spider-like crack, claiming that was from a fragment of a bullet from inside. But this, in fact, was fired from the outside, from inside the triple underpass. A fellow named Jim Lewis has gone through junkyards in the South, firing high-powered rifles through windshields to see if he could hit a dummy in the back seat. He's not only succeeded, but Louisa, he discovered it leaves a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, just as we see here, and makes the sound of a firecracker as it passes through. You may recall many witnesses reporting what they thought was a firecracker. It was actually the bullet passing through the windshield. In frame 225 of the Zapruder film, you can actually see the bullet has already hit, and Jack is clutching his throat. Then we have the mortician who prepared the body told an investigator, in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back, 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. Now, the tracheostomy, the small incision, had been obfuscated by enlarging it so it wouldn't be obvious it was wound of entry, as I shall address. But notice here, this is the actual physician, the mortician who prepared the body for funeral, Thomas Evan Robinson, giving a report to an investigator on May 26, 1994. Wounds, large gaping hole in back of head, patched by stretching a piece of rubber. He thinks it was filled with plaster of Paris. Small wound in the right temple. Then he talks about that skull flap, crescent flap, flap down 3 inches, meaning it folded back into the skull. Approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds in the face packed with wax. He discovered these when he was embalming the body because the embalming fluid was flowing out of these wounds. David Mandick brilliantly inferred that those shrapnel wounds were caused by shards of glass that hit Jack in the face when the bullet passed through the windshield. Then we have the wound in the back, 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the backbone. Gerald Ford would re-describe this wound from the uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck in order to make the magic bullet theory more plausible. But David has demonstrated it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. Adrenaline glands and brain removed, other organs removed, and put no smelling or discoloration to the face. That's significant. It means he died instantly. So here you have Malcolm Kilduff announcing his death and saying it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head while pointing to his right temple, all of which appears to be completely correct. As I explained, you then had that reported on the national networks all that day. You can still find their footage online, which I'm convinced is why the American public, when they finally were given the contents of the Warren report, of only 2 hits, both fired from behind with 1 miss, were in a state of disbelief. They already knew he'd been shot at least twice from the front, and now, as I've explained, yet a 3rd time in the head from in front. Here are references to David Mantik, including 20 conclusions after 9 visits to the National Archives at assassinationresearch.com, which I co-edited with John P. Costello, lectures he gave at the Lancer Conference in 2009, others about the largest metallic fragment from 2015, the Houston mock trial 2017, and a primer for beginners 2018, and a Mantik website courtesy of Bernard King in the UK. So it's easy to find more about David. Several of those are also at assassinationscience.com. Some 60 witnesses to the limo stop. Some saw it slow dramatically, others saw it come to a complete stop. The limo slowed dramatically as it came to a complete stop. So depending where you were, how much your view was obfuscated, you might have seen it slow dramatically, you might have seen it come to a complete stop, or all of the above. This was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity, it had to be removed. John Costello's collation of eyewitness reports, which you can find at Assassination Research, about the assassination includes dozens and dozens about the limo stop. Some reported seeing it slow dramatically, others that it came to a complete stop, which makes sense since from different positions, different witnesses would have seen it slow dramatically as it came to a complete stop. Among them is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. As Daniel Gallup has observed, Foster seems to have no idea that her recollections contradict the official record. Tony told Deborah, for some reason the car stopped. It did stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped. And all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why the car stopped. The way she delivers these lines, Gallup observed, I doubt Tony had ever seen the Extant Z film and had no idea her recollections contradicted that film. He said he was reminded of David Lifton's early 1971 interviews with the Newmans, who also said the limit had stopped. They were on the grassy knoll. They, the family, the parents, and their 2 kids are lying flat on the grass once they heard the bullets begin to be fired. They were right there beside the limo. They have no way of knowing at the time. The Z film showed no such stop. All of this is to say the earliest recollections of individuals are likely to be the most significant, he added, especially if there's evidence of a lack of exposure to contrary viewpoints that might influence memory. For a few more, Billy Lovelady, who was on the steps of the Texas School Book Depository. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly, who was Lee and Billy's supervisor in the book depository, who appears to be a completely honest man. The car I saw, the president's car, swerved to the left and stopped somewhere down in this area. Mr. Bellin questioning him and trying to obfuscate the facts. When you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop? Mr. Truly, it would be hard to say over a second or two like it that I didn't see, I just saw it stop. I don't know, I didn't see it start up. Mrs. Earl Cabell, this is the wife of the mayor, 4 cars behind the presidential limousine at the top of Elm at the time of the shots. I am aware that the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped. Later, Mr. Hubert, was that when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Campbell, every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. Later, we were dead still for a matter of some seconds. Well, here we have Jean Hill and Mary Mormon, 2 women who were on the opposite side of the grassy knoll. Mary had a Polaroid camera with which she took a famous photograph. She'd hand it to her friend Jean Hill, who had applied preservative and put it in her pocket. They saw it come to a complete stop. They were in the street at the time, but they are shown in the Zapruder film as being on the grass. Noel Twyman, who published a brilliant book called Bloody Treason back in 1997, asked Roderick why the background was blurred in frame 302, but not in frame 303. And Ryan explained that the camera was panning the limo in 302, but not in 303 where it was stationary. On page 159, he added he'd shown it to his son, who's also in the film industry, and he agreed it was moving in 302, but standing still in 303. Here we have Jean and Mary. Jean was Mary the red coat, Mary the dark coat. And in fact, we find that they were standing in the street. They have repeatedly explained, but that there has been efforts to suppress their testimony. This is a brilliant find by Jack White, a legendary photo and film analyst, where we have, although this next film is blurry, when enlarged to this size, it's clear enough to show that Mary's head lower circle is so far below Jean's upper circle that Mary had stepped off the curb before Jean did. Also note that she seems hunched over to take the photo instead of being upright, as in Zapruder. This is a famous photograph she took where Jack has just been hit. Actually, on his shoulder, there's a chunk of his skull and brains, which one shot appears to have been fired from the grassy knoll by a figure known as Badge Man. You can see him in the lower right, that Jack White, working with a fellow named Gary Mack, who would later become the curator of the Sixth Floor Museum, would seek. They together discovered it, but Gary Mack would go to the dark side and seek to obfuscate all the proof of conspiracy. Jack even discovered a line of sight here that Mary's photograph had to be on that line of sight where David Mandick and I went to Dealey Plaza with surveying equipment and verified that Jack was exactly right, that Mary's lens had to be in the street when the photograph was taken.
I'm sorry, Jim. Let me just.
The other film. This is
Jim.
The original before it was edited. Yeah, Louisa.
Who is Badge Man? Yeah, who is Badge Man? I didn't see.
Oh, Badge Man.
Where is he standing?
Someone in a police uniform who was firing from the grassy knoll. You see him in the lower right. He was discovered in the Mormon photograph, almost in the middle, up a center, just above the concrete.
No, I know. I just don't. I can't see him. Can you point out with your cursor or?
Yeah, sure. Well, he's right in this vicinity, but the point I'm making is here. Here's the enlargement. Do you see him? His head. This is the blast from his rifle. He's wearing a police uniform.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I see it now. It took a little study, but yes, you can see. Yes.
Oh yeah. Well,
yes. See, you're used to Jim. You're used to looking at these images. So for people who are looking at them at the first time, they really need to be. They need to slowly take their time. And I'm glad you're pointing it out because it wasn't obvious.
100%.
Thank you.
With you, Louisa.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
So we have witnesses who saw the film before it was edited, including Erwin Schwartz, who was a friend of Zapruder, William Raymond, Rich De La Rosa, Gregory Burnham. Here's Erwin Schwartz, observed brain matter blown out to the left rear. An associate of Abraham Zapruder, Erwin Schwartz, viewed the film in what may have been its original state at Eastman Kodak, where it was developed. Nearly 60 witnesses have reported the limousine slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt. When Noel asked him about the limo stop, he was vague and could not recall, but when Noel asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said he'd seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left. They'd seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and that had blown out to the left and rear. Twyman pressed him on this crucial part, but Schwartz was emphatic. His account may be found in Bloody Treason, 1997. Then we have, they make 4 important observations, those who have seen the other film. It includes a turn from Houston onto Elm, where, as I explained, the driver swerved out too widely, nearly brought to a halt. I think we were missing 5 seconds there that were edited out, or about 100 frames. It shows Greer bringing the limousine to an abrupt halt. During the limousine stop, hit at least twice in the head, once from behind as he slumps forward, once from the left front, and he slumps to the side. Greer watches the whole time, then hits the accelerator. And now, of course, we know from David's additional research, he was, during the limo stop, also hit yet a 3rd time in the forehead, apparently as Jackie was easing him up after slumping forward from the shot from behind. Here we have a further confirmation of the blowout to the left rear, which obviously indicated a shot from the right front, come from Secret Service agents such as Sam Kenney and Vincent Gullo Jr. Vince Palomara, the leading expert on the Secret Service, wrote to Gullo to explain that Kenney had told him of his discovery of a piece of the right rear of the president's skull in the limousine during the flight back to Washington, D.C., and that another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine trunk. Gullo confirmed Kinney's statements to Palomara, saying he was totally familiar with the facts as Palomara outlined them. What's important about this, Louisa, is in the Zapruder, the trunk is completely clear. It's bereft of blood and gore. And of course, they had to conceal that it was blown out to the left rear. The motorcycle escort officers, it turns out, gave audio reports, interviews with Fred Newcomb in 1993. Larry Rivera transcribed. And it was a veritable bonanza of what happened during the limo stop, where he was hit at least twice in the head. As I've explained, it now turns out to have been yet a third time. That Officer Baker dismounted his bike and ran between the cars to the grassy knoll, which he obviously could not have done had the cars been in motion. That Officer Jackson on the right side rode his bike up the grassy knoll until it fell over and then proceeded on foot. That 5 Secret Service agents surrounded the presidential limousine. So here you have what we think is authentic. This is from the Knicks, and you see Clint Hill rushing forward. But in fact, this was taking place when the limousine was not moving. Here's a diagram where we have Hargis, who was impacted so hard with the debris from the shot that blew his brains out the back. He initially thought he himself had been shot, parking his bike, running between the vehicles, Jackson motoring up the grassy knoll, 5 swarming JFK, taking a chunk of skull from a little boy and throwing it in the back seat, while Clint Hill rushes forward to push Jackie backwards. Here you can actually see some of the motorcycle tracks on the grassy knoll. Do you see them there, Louisa?
Yeah.
From the top and the bottom. These
Yes.
are framed from the Bill film showing what appeared to be the tire marks. In fact, Mark Lane actually interviewed a couple of witnesses who were there who reported seeing the motorcycle guy motor right up onto the grassy knoll until his bike fell over. And here you have Officer Hargis returning to his bicycle in the aftermath. Here you have Hargis again going back to retrieve his, there you see Gene Hill and Mary Mormon. This is Beverly Oliver standing with the blonde hair and the beige coat, who took a film of the assassination that the Secret Service took from her and which has never been returned. Larry has done 2 videos of his study about the JFK Horsemen, the 4 escort officers. You can find them on YouTube. The JFK Horsemen Part 1 of 2 and the JFK Horsemen Part 2 of 2, best version, slightly tweaked. You can find those online. Where Larry Rivera, Gary King, and I do a new JFK show every Wednesday. How the switch was done: the 8mm all-ray split film developed in Dallas was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Saturday, 23 November 1963, where they had to have a shop owner open his store to buy an 8mm projector so they could review it. Now you had one crew working on Saturday and a completely different crew on Sunday. So the crew working on Sunday were unaware the film had already been brought in on Saturday, where they were brought a 16mm unsplit film developed in Rochester at Hawkeye Works, brought to the NPIC on Sunday, 24 November, which then was used to replace the original. Doug Horn, who was a senior analyst for military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, has done brilliant work in documenting this meticulously. He has a 5-volume collection inside the Assassination Records Review Board that I strongly recommend. Why it had to be fixed: JFK was hit at least 4 times in the back from behind and the throat from in front, at least twice in the head, once from behind and once from the right front, and now we know again from the left front, also in the head. There were at least 6 shooters who fired from 8 to 10 shots, possibly more. I now believe there were as many as 8 shooters. I mean, identify 6 of them by name, rank, and serial number. Here's a very famous photograph taken by James Ike Alchins. Number 1 circles the white spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center, where JFK's left ear would be if his left ear were visible, that shot through the windshield. Number 2 circles a figure extending out from the book depository, looking at what's going on. This part of the film has been modified, as have many other parts. That turns out to be Lee Harvey Oswald. We identified him on the basis of his weight, his build, his shirt, and his T-shirt. which were the same as Lee was wearing when he was arrested. The government would like to claim it was Billy Lovelady who said himself that he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, and he was surprised they'd be confused. He's actually standing behind Lee with his hands upraised, and they had to obfuscate his shirt because he was wearing a red and white short sleeve shirt, vertically striped, that would have made it very conspicuous. The three is circling the window to the broom closet of a uranium mining company that was a CIA asset in the Dow Tex. Not only was this anti-Castro Cuban firing 3 shots with a Mannlicher Carcano, but he was supervised there by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was arrested when he left the building and briefly questioned and then allowed to leave. Here in number 4, you see JFK, LBJ's security vehicle. They're already responding. Jacks are looking around with no idea. One of the speakers suggested that actually the Secret Service agent there was firing some additional diversionary rounds to generate confusion. This is by far the most famous photograph and significant for study in the history of the assassination, to which we've devoted a huge amount of attention. So when you put all the pieces together, the sequence is very much on this order. The Jack's hit in the back by a shot from the county records building. That's the first green. Then there's a second shot fired from there that hits a manhole cover in the grass. Then he's shot from inside the triple underpass. I originally thought he was shot from the south knoll. That's the bottom left, that orange arrow. But now I need to add, because there was a shot fired from there, that new shot to the head. But the shot to the throat actually was inside the triple underpass, so I need to add that arrow. Then in addition, we have the 3 yellow from the Dow Tex, where there were 2 misses with 1 hit. 1 miss and hit the curb and injured James Tague, the bystander. Another missed and hit a chrome strip above the limousine and created an indent. Then after the limousine was brought to a halt, he was hit in the back of the head. The red from the grassy knoll shows a shot fired that was pulled because it would have hit Jackie. That appears to have been by a Dallas police officer named Roscoe White, who also was a stand-in for Lee Oswald in the backyard photographs, where Lee himself said that was his face pasted on someone else's body. Larry Rivera was able to prove it and presented that proof at this conference. And then the shot that hit him in the right temple was from the intersection of the triple underpass and the grassy knoll. So who shot the alleged film of the assassination? A question raised by Jack White. It's fascinating. Jack had noticed that his secretary, Zapruder's secretary, Marilyn Zeitzman, appears to be in front of him and making it impossible for him to film. But the answer to the question is no one filmed the Zapruder film because it was made in a laboratory, and no one shot a film that was made in a laboratory.
Yeah, Jim, you have to look at this. You have to look at, I mean, this is comprehensive evidence, and you have to wonder why this is the only film that has ever been made available, and that there's no other source. With all those people there, there's no other sources of video, there's no other sources of photos, and you've mentioned in a previous report that all the local film developing shops had their any pictures and film that they developed from that event confiscated. Is that correct? Can you confirm that?
Yeah, let me add on that. I mean, Jean Hill was approached immediately after the assassination by government agents who took her to a building and asked her how many shots she'd seen or heard, and she reported 4 or more. They insisted, no, that was impossible because there were only 3, and they took her photographs from her. They were appropriating all the photos and films. You're absolutely right. They had agents stationed at all the photo developing labs in Dallas for the next 2 weeks. And they'd take any photos or films related to the assassination and leave a little card, a copy of which you can find in Richard Trask's book, Pictures of the Pain. May I say, by the way, that those who want a more expansive discussion of the medical evidence and how it ties together with the film and the ballistic evidence, check out on BitChute, BITCHUTE, where we're putting the GoldFish Report, JFK, who is responsible and why, an interview I gave with Brian Ruhe, R-U-H-E, or if you want to go in greater depth, you can check out my book, JFK, Who, How, and Why, which has 15 contributors and is available at moonrockabooks.com.
Jim, thank you very much for this presentation. I know this is an extreme amount of work and research that went into presenting this and to discovering this. You were just at the conference. Can you tell us anything more about the conference that you attended?
Yeah, it was pretty fascinating in multiple different respects. I was speaking about the Operation Mockingbird alive and well, and how the CIA began infiltrating the media in the 1950s. So by 1975, William Colby, then its director, testified to Congress that the agency owned everyone of any significance in the media, followed by an article in Rolling Stone by Carl Bernstein in 1977, The CIA and the Media, in which he quoted high officials of the agency boasting that their greatest successes had been with Time Life, the New York Times, and
Sorry.
CBS.
Go ahead.
Where if you, in that era, if you controlled Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS, you had a lock on the dissemination of news in the United States. That control of the media has been advanced by the consolidation of 90% of the news outlets under just 6 companies. They get all their news from the AP and from Reuters, and Reuters owns the AP, and Reuters in turn is owned by the Rothschilds. That gives you some idea of the control over the media, which has been greatly threatened by the emergence of the internet, which is why you've had the social media giants cracking down. Louisa, I've just lost my Facebook page because I published a piece about censorship by Facebook on Facebook, and they took me out. Just as I had my blog previously taken down, just as I was moving to the new blog at jamesfetzer.org. So I was documenting all of this and showing, for example, a panoply of 100 executives from CNN, all of whom were dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. A panel from NBC of 100 executives, all of whom are dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. A panel from the New York Times of 100 executives, all of whom are dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. And where even Facebook has acknowledged that it's taking down site at the request of the U.S. and the Israeli government.
Absolutely.
It's very, very troubling, Louisa, what's going on here.
Well, as we talked about yesterday in our POTUS report, the president did have some comments yesterday about Facebook once he realized Chuck Schumer's daughter worked there as well. It's terrible what Facebook is doing. As you know, we're very, very censored. I mean, you know, who knows if, I mean, it always seems like the same few people comment on the page, and I think that there are probably others, but it's being filtered. And let's not forget that John JFK Jr., I think when he launched his magazine, this was his way of telling the world who killed his father, who was behind it.
I know, it's fascinating. We actually had a report about John's death, fascinating, which confirmed that it was an assassination, no doubt about it. That was another fascinating part. And just before I spoke, Kevin Shipp, who's a CIA guy who's turned critic of the agency, spoke. It was a wonderful piece, probably the one from which I learned the most, and he was confirming many points I've made and mentioned Operation Mockingbird in passing, which of course was a perfect advertisement for what I was about to do.
Well, Jim, I'll tell you, there's, you know, I think there's this undeclared war going on. I think there's a lot of disinfo out there. And I think that people need to inform themselves, watch GoldFish Report, follow Jim's blogs, read his books, and keep your mind open to, you know, to other possible explanations. It's not what you think it is. It's not always what it appears to be. As Jim showed us today with this Zapruder film, the only film that was manufactured and released to explain this false flag.
Just as a technical point, there were 8 different videos that took parts of the motorcade. The most important ones, like the Knicks, have also been edited using the Zapruder as the guide, but they did it in a flawed way, as I illustrated with the Knicks versus Zapruder, in terms of Clint Hill and Jackie's interaction on the trunk of the limousine.
Right, and so this is very significant, and again, we have to wonder why. We've gone through the whys, we've gone through the whos, you went through the what. We all know when it was, where it was, and the why. There's, as you mentioned, there were many sharpshooters there that day, anti-Castro, the Israel, the Texas Oil, CIA Mafia. There were a lot of people who wanted to stop John Kennedy from and of course Lyndon Johnson from, you know, accomplishing what he set out to accomplish in this, you know, in his inauguration speech, and of course in that address to the American Newspaper Publishers.
Thanks so much, Louisa, for this opportunity to address what most people think the Zapruder film is the closest thing to absolute truth we have about the assassination. It's very important they understand that is not the case, and how we know it's not the case, and how it implicates those who were actually responsible for setting up the death of our 35th president and then covering it up.
Yeah, so it's faked. It's a composite. It's a composite video, you're saying, completely edited.
Yeah.
It's a fake,
John
it's a fake
Costello
video.
uses the word fabrication, but they used authentic footage and then edited, changed, and revised, patched the wound, and so forth, as I displayed.
Fake, fake video. All right, Jim, thank you very much. And to all of our viewers, we want to just wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. It is also going to fall on the same 22nd, November 22nd date. So, Jim, thank you. Have a great holiday. Happy Thanksgiving, Jim. And we'll see you next week doing another POTUS report.
You got it. Thanks, Louisa. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everyone. Have a happy Thanksgiving and a safe holiday. And this concludes this edition of the GoldFish Report.